Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, Praise of Light Podcast. We had the AAR on my debate about 3 months ago with Pragmatic Culture on NRX or Anglo-Dutch.
Was it 3 months ago? Jeez.
Yeah, I know. I broke my ankle after all, so it would have been a lot sooner, but yeah. So now it's time to go. So we'll open up with you. So the first question, Pragmatic Culture, is where do you
Uh,
think you did good and where do you think you underperformed?
I think I did generally good in litigating the case for NRX, or I guess broadly speaking, being a better implement for reason, or not for reason, for meaning, excuse me, and bringing that back into like the life of people today and giving them more purpose and drive and things like that. But I kind of, that wasn't necessarily really the point of the debate. It was, how do you handle the left and all that. And I made that point sort of circuitously because I tried to establish the idea that what we're seeing in the rise of the left today is really due to a spiritual crisis in people and not really an economic one. And then tried to get into how NRX provides a better spiritual formula for countering the left than the Anglo-Dutch model. But I didn't really lay that groundwork well in the beginning to make that point. But yeah, that was sort of my big criticism of myself listening back to it. Another criticism I have is I sound like a LARPy sued when I try to like shoehorn in terms like the Faustian Teutonic man, and I tried to shoehorn in signifier and signified because I just listened to Trudeau Tom and Dick Dickinson talk about postmodernism on The Absolute State, which is their podcast. And so I was trying to, I, I was formulating sentences as I was going, and so I was like grasping at words that I'd kind of just recently heard. And it's like I listened back to myself saying those things, and I'm like, oh, this is completely unrelated and cringe. But those were the biggest ones for me.
Okay. I guess for my part, I think that as far as dealing with the proposition, I did fairly well. One of my biggest missteps or mistakes was when you, Pragmatic Culture, said that the Romanovs were not the true spirit of Russia, but the prior leadership. Well, the prior leadership was before the Mongols, and they were sort of an aristocratic republic. And we see this in Richard Pipes' book, A History of Property, where he compares Russia to England. And the Russia prior to the Mongol conquest was much more akin to the Greek city-states of, say, 500 BC than they were to, say, the Romanovs of the 18th century. But I think we have Frédéric Voltaire Bastiat here. So I'll ask you, Frédéric Voltaire Bastiat, where do you think, first of all, Pragmatic Culture did well and where maybe he could improve? And then,
See,
yeah, start there. So, yeah.
let's see. I think Pragmatic Culture had a really great opening into the debate, explaining the core of political philosophy and just explaining himself of the neo-reactionary tradition. And I think the critique of the Anglo-Dutch system was pretty salient. But where you're strong is at is the historical relevance of the failed reactionary or later exhausted reactionary powers at the time during the 19th century. That's I thought that was a really good counterpoint, and your points about Marxism was pretty good about that every country that had like this aristocratic tradition, such as Russia, France, and Spain. Yeah, yeah, tend to be more susceptible to more anarchist, Marxist, revolutionary, and these uprisings usually upheave, well, basically the status quo because you basically pissed off a bunch of peasants. And
Yeah.
with and also your mention about the Anglo-Dutch, the point of being the Anglo-Dutch system basically expanded the middle class, having the middle class power, the in the middle, like high, low versus the middle, that kind of thing. And what liberal democracy did was basically basically giving the power to the middle. Maybe that's why we have maybe that's why liberal democracy lasted long as it did. Um, let's see, where pragmatic culture uh, was at the strongest or at the weakest was trying to explain the spiritual death of the West of the Anglo-Dutch system. I thought that he didn't really properly explain himself there. Um, just that's all I have right now.
Okay. I guess as an opening response, what would you say pragmatic culture to Frédéric Voltaire Bastiat's comments?
I think I didn't really attack the Anglo-Dutch system on the basis of what we were discussing, which was how to defeat the left. And looking back on it, there was a point I would have liked to have made, which we're not relitigating it now, so I won't bother mentioning it. But it was, it was a point I concede that I could have done better. Again, I was trying to set it up with the groundwork, like, we've sort of had the Anglo-Dutch system. It's led to the spiritual vacantism, which has led to the rise of the left. NRX will reestablish, a sort of spiritual hierarchy and give the people meaning. And I admittedly failed at setting that up correctly. So yeah, it does, the criticisms then kind of come off because we're talking about sort of two different systems, two different cosmologies, essentially. Like the system in one case is that of sort of using a material standard to try to defeat the left. The other is sort of using a spiritual standard. And so it was very much, talking past each other, sort of.
Yeah, I think that might actually be true. I think another point that on my part that I missed and maybe could have been stronger on is a common NRX objection to the Anglo-Dutch system is that you kind of sold out to the left, and that's why you survived. But then again, so is fascism, right? Fascism is socialism, and socialism is a result of the French Revolution. So I think for both of us, to be honest, the left has shifted the Overton window to the extent that both of us have had to make changes, whether we've wanted to or not. And I think in any future debates, it would be probably more useful to acknowledge that at the beginning of the debate and then say, okay, maybe the argument could then revolve around which concession to the left was more self-destructive. Because I think both sides have had to adapt to the left shifting the Overton window. And I think maybe that's a better way to frame it. I think you would probably agree with that, pragmatic culture.
To some extent, yes, and to some extent, no, because it's always sort of, it's a question of, has core ideology just changed or has marketing the ideology changed? Because that's sort of a big deal. I mean, because, NRX hasn't been a movement essentially for ever. Like,
it's pretty new. Yeah, about like 10 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, maybe longer if there's some, like, if suddenly Mulbug dies and we can dig out some, like, journals he was scribbling as like a sixth grader, maybe longer. But other than that, it's a very new. So it's hard to say how much it has been influenced by the left, how much it's just sort of reacting to the modern Overton window, and how much, is just marketing.
Well, I mean, I think you and I would both agree, though, right, that fascism and Nazism are realizing the Overton window shift of the left.
Yeah,
I mean, certainly Mussolini was, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, fascism, Nazism, it's all sort of. I kind of mentioned in the debate, fascism is modernism sort of wearing NRX's skin to some extent, and that's a big. I think that's worth mentioning, just because it's still worth mentioning. I think someone commented this when I was watching the stream again in the comments as they were flashing by. It was something along the lines of, the three things that came out of the French Revolution were liberty, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And then he sort of broke that down into sort of like the three modern political ideologies of the 21st century. It's like liberté, which is general liberalism, égalité, which is communism, and fraternité, which is fascism. So it's all, it's all still modernism. And, fascism is too. but it's, it borrows more from NRX than the other two, obviously. Although I've been, talking with some friends from tanky Twitter, so to speak, or just left Twitter, indeed. It seems more and more like the more you look at what the left has become, especially the CIA-funded left, we could live to see the day where Marx is considered a reactionary writer, which would give me a hearty chuckle.
No, I mean, Marx did say that homosexuality was bourgeois decadence, but
right.
So Frédéric Bastiat, what do you think about this little clarification here?
See, I think like what from hearing, like you're like where the conversation should have been framed, like where the left had took advantage of the overtone window. I think that's a really good framing of the debate. Well, as well, looking back on it, like just hindsight is 2020. My thoughts on why the left will win in the long run is just basically what pragmatic culture said, that liberal democracy just need to appease all these identities at once, and eventually, the middle will be eventually consumed with the low, like basically weirdo. I'm kind of surprised that you didn't mention bio-Leninism, pragmatic culture. That idea.
I don't want to I'm not knowledgeable on enough of it specifically to do it. Like I said, I was already like intellectually LARPing too hard when I mentioned signifiers and signified, and the Teutonic Faustian man reference was a little bit more relevant to the conversation, but just uttering the words is just sort of a stretch. But I'm open. That is sort of my point. You're right, and I should have made that point, but I don't know if the terminology would have been right.
Well, biological Leninism is kind of like a fringe concept anyway, but the idea behind it isn't exactly new. It's just new language, new terminology. On Todd's side, on his defense, like it's definitely a more pragmatic, realist defense of the Anglo-Dutch system. It's not really the basis of his ideology, but he viewed it as the best system that counteracts the left, or at least hold the left at bay by just conceding to them. That's one of the reasons why these monarchist powers or the aristocratic order of the 19th century sort of just eroded because of these democratic movements and the later liberal reforms to appease the middle class. That's what I'm getting at. Am I getting that right, Todd?
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that I would argue that British and the Dutch and the Americans have come up with the best system in blunting communist, socialist, Jacobin influences historically. So yeah, I would agree with your assessment.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
we can all agree that it is definitely the hedonism and the rise of basically weirdos on the left of the modern left today is definitely exhausting the Anglo-Dutch system.
Well, so one of the things I didn't get across well in the debate was this sort of idea that liberalism and Marxism, to some extent, have been in this sort of symbiotic relationship, a bit sort of throughout the past 200 years or so, where it's always sort of been a dance mainly between the two. And it's really been, people on the right like to talk about how conservatives don't really conserve anything. Like at this point, like the conservatives of today are trying to conserve late 90s culture, and 50 years from now they're going to be conserving like the culture of the 2020s or something. And
I just real quick to interject here. If you look at 1917, we could certainly argue that the British and Americans favored the February Kerensky Revolution, but isn't it somewhat ironic that it was Prussia, the classic reactionary autocracy, that shuttled Lenin to Russia? That seems to be somewhat interesting.
Oh, well, they did that specifically to just, absolutely wreck Russia from inside because they knew that's what would happen. I mean, that was a wartime that was a short-sighted wartime strategy, undoubtedly. It was not, I don't think they could have foreseen the rise of the Soviet Union. I think they were just saying, hey, let's send this revolutionary back into like the political heart of our enemy and watch them collapse from within. So we only have to fight a war from one front.
I think one thing that maybe should have been clarified is, let me ask you this. From the point of view of NRX, is Rhodesia and South Africa, are they NRX as well?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought of it like that. I'd say probably no. They're closer to a reactionary, fascist, whatever you call it, system of government than obviously, the Americans and the English were at that time, who of course strongly condemned their actions. But they were still, it was still fairly free market for the most part. It was still, a functioning. It was basically a managed liberal economy. It was basically, it's basically like how the Chinese are managing capitalism today to some extent, except rather than having it be like, the military class and the economic class kind of trade power in China, the two classes are the Boers and the native Africans and stuff, and there's no real trade of power. It's just the Boers pretty much running everything.
I think Todd just left.
What?
I think Todd left.
It's probably internet connection. So we'll keep the show going until Todd comes back, because if he doesn't come back in 15 minutes or so, I think the stream itself just shuts down. But what do you think of my political analysis of Rhodesia and South Africa?
I don't know much about it, but for some reason I should support it. I have no idea why.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's unfortunate that Rhodesia is pretty much just whatchamacallit. It's sort of just, it's a meme at this point. It's kind of like Dixieland. Like, you always see those people in Confederate uniforms LARPing and stuff about, oh, Todd's asking in the Discord, how does he rejoin? You can rejoin by, or I'll tell him in the group chat, but I think if he just clicks his own link again, he'll be in there.
See,
let me just tell him.
Is it possible that South Africa offers a model of an implosion of liberal democracy or majoritarian democracy? Yes.
An accelerated one, yes, but I mean, it depends. Like, people are very black-pilled on, the demographic situation of the United States and things like that, but it's honestly still salvageable. And, people have pointed out that there was a white minority ruling South Africa and Rhodesia for a long period of time. I don't know if it could ever... Oh, hey, you're back.
Yeah, sorry, guys. That was a bit of a goof up. What was your main point about Rhodesia, South Africa?
Yeah, okay. So in China, you kind of have this managed capitalist thing. And, there's there's kind of two parties and two sides to it. There's like the military might of China and there's the economic might of China. And you have like the military and the economic power sort of formally swapping, or de jure swapping, who's in charge at the moment, while they both kind of do their own thing. In South Africa, it's sort of like that, except it's the blacks and the Boers, and there's no real swapping of powers. It was just the Boers doing everything. So I still think it was still liberal, but it was managed sort of. It was almost corporatist, I guess you could say. So it's close to fascism in governance, but certainly not economically.
Yeah. I think maybe one thing that as maybe advice for your side is, since neo-reaction is kind of a third level, right? It's not thrown and altar. It's not fascist. It's kind of a third iteration of the same ideas.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, it might be constructive to argue that it hasn't been tried yet. Therefore, historical examples, while useful, aren't necessarily a knockout in the ring, if you know what I mean.
No, yeah, I see that, and I sometimes like playing that game, sometimes don't, because I used to be an ANCAP for a while, and that game was played and it wasn't played because, sometimes, you like to appeal to situations where it's, oh, the free market worked here, so this is how it would be in Ancapistan. And, but, oh, Ancapistan has never been tried yet. So it's like, it's a delicate balance when you're debating, because people sort of pick up on that, well, if it's never been tried, how are you using these examples? And, why should we try it if it's never been tried? How do we know it's going to work? All these sorts of things. But I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say exactly. That is kind of the trade-off, right? If it's too new, people then say, well, why should I believe it can work? But if you limit yourself completely to past examples, you kind of trap yourself. So there's kind of this maybe delicate balance or a dance.
Yeah, what I would say I'd say there's good examples to take from in modern times that are at least moderately NRX. Like, I think appealing to Franco's Spain I think that's actually pretty good optics, and I think it's a good example too, because Franco ran Spain completely successfully. He defeated the rebels in Catalonia. He pretty much wiped out the communist scourge, and Spain was the 8th largest economic power in the world while he was ruling pretty consistently. And now you see today in Spain people saying, man, we kind of want that guy back. So I think, you do have some sort of appeals to that sort of attitude. And you could also, and there are a few other powers I think you could appeal to, but unfortunately we're largely limited to, the esoteric writings of somebody along the lines of like a Corneliu Codreanu, Evola, Spengler, things like that. So we do have to try to work on de-intellectualizing ourselves and trying to get a little bit more normie appeal.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on this, Frédéric Bastiat?
I think that's a good way to go. Good way to go here. Just like, well, there has to be like a balance if we're gonna be like rely on historical examples than just pure ideology. Insert Zizek meme. I have no real commentary on this yet.
Well, that's kind of interesting. I think Zizek goes so far left, he's a reactionary.
Yeah, I was about to say Zizek is such an interesting figure. Mainly, it was pointed out recently and I don't know if you saw this. Did you see Kraut and T's? I think it's his newest video. I haven't checked if he's posted anything since, but it was sort of on theories of history, but only the last 3 minutes were really about theories of history, philosophically speaking.
I did not see that.
It was, I like the first, it was like 20 something minutes, and like the first 17, 16, 18 or so were all like fairly decent. They were about how the field of history is expanded to include sort of other fields, so that you get a more accurate picture of what happened back then. And I didn't find myself disagreeing until he tried to tie all it into like his historical determinism is evil, Hegel is evil, but he did get one thing right, which was that Hegel, and a lot of Marxists are going to deny that, will try to deny this, is the father just as much of fascism and a rebirth of sort of anti-liberal sentiment from the right, as much as he is as the father of anti-liberal sentiment on the left. And so, and that with how that relates to Zizek is essentially a Hegelian first and foremost, who sort of wears the Marxist clothes and speaks the Marxist talk, because essentially mainly for economic reasons and less so for cultural reasons. He wears a lot of different masks because he's a postmodernist too, in terms of how he in terms of how he deconstructs culture. He's somewhat of a modernist when he talks about making appeals to current institutions and their goodness. Like when he talks about Le Pen, he talks about how the real Europe is like this post-French Revolution liberal world order that's kind of been established since then. So he borrows from a lot of philosophies, and he speaks a bunch of different languages in that sense. But really, I think being that his philosophical base is essentially Hegelian, he will, he's easily co-opted by reactionaries. And I think to some extent, I don't think, a lot of people, I've spoken with Braving Ruin about this too. Like, is he a closet reactionary? I used to be like, yeah, he probably is. But in all honesty, I think he's just someone I think he's playing both sides a bit, and he's seeing how things go. But I don't think he's as afraid of the reactionary right as he makes himself out to be. But that'll make him an interesting figure going forward, though.
I think on the right, we can all agree that Kraut is a loser cuck who had a video. Allied bombings were justified. I mean, what kind of a loser cuck German says that, bombing Dresden was justified? I mean, how do you deal with that, Pragmatic Culture? That's such a loser cuck thing to say.
It is. Oh, no. He's, I despise him because he's a loser and a coward. And, I've always considered hopping on, I occasionally try to call into the Ralph Retort and these other, the remnants of internet blood sport shows. And I've always considered saying that, one, I'd fight people just for fun, not just because I'd have bad blood. But if I were to fight someone who I had bad blood with, I'd love to throw my hat in the ring with some of these, absolute skeptic losers. Kraut and T probably being on the top of the list, because, I mean, I wouldn't even have to train. It would just be that easy. But yeah, he's a loser, and worse beyond that. Every subject he touches, he's just wrong in. Like he's just wrong and pretends to be right. That's the greater sin. Not ignorance in certain topics, but arrogance in professing how much you know about those topics. Like, you make the Dunning-Kruger the Dunning-Kruger joke has been worn to death at this point, especially throughout that whole drama. But it's absolutely true.
I'm just waiting for Kraut and T to saying that he'll agree with Hitchens that Lenin was justified in creating a secular Russia.
Oh God!
What are your thoughts on this, Frédéric Bastiat?
Oh man, actually, I'm kind of just thinking about Fukuyama since he was mentioned like several times by Pragmatic Culture, like the Fukuyamanist end of history, and since then since then he just sort of just changed his mind. Not exactly changed his mind, but more like reform his thesis, like in his last two books on state formation and political development. Just now he now believes that the end of history actually started around like I want to say like 1815. Not eight. Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's about right.
When Napoleon loses.
Yes. Then the Vienna system was formed, and then the rise of democratic movements and nationalism, and you know the history. I don't have to explain it. Yeah. Just he sort of just refined it and is also in his recent book Identity. Like it's sort of like a main theme throughout his work about the politics of resentment and the demand for dignity. Like that's sort of just how he viewed why democracy spread. That there's a innate demand experience the human soul. This and he traces back to the Christian Protestant doctrine, even Hegel and Rousseau about this innate demand for recognition.
Wait, does Fukuyama call Hegel a liberal?
No, he doesn't.
Okay, thank God, because like people who try to co-opt Hegel as like some avatar of like the Enlightenment get the bullet first, like without exception.
I have a question for you, Pragmatic Culture, maybe for future clarification for such debates.
Sure.
Broader Republican tradition that we see from, I mean, after all, Aristotle, Plato's The Republic is the first work on, I guess you could say, Western political theory. But you have like the classical republicanism of like Greece and Rome. You've got Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero. The medieval Italian city-states and Switzerland. To what extent do you consider, to what extent, two questions. Is classical republicanism liberal? And to what extent is, say, the Dutch and the, say, 13 colonies classically republican?
Well, classical republicanism, I would say, is philosophically neutral inherently, because I think, you have in Rome a system that existed, uh, you know, before all other political systems that we're currently talking about. And so their system of governance is, just it's beyond the scope of what we could talk about here. And so I'd say it could tend either way. Like when Fascist Ball is still on Twitter, he's just at a different account now, and I don't want to dead name it that so that he gets banned again. But if you know who he is, he's still out there, and he talks about he's opposed to using fascism as a philosophical doctrine, but combining it with a lot of different things. His preferred style would have been sort of a Roman Republic style fascist state, with sort of with a kind of emperor as a head, an Il Duce. He's also he's not opposed either to sort of like the fascist monarchism of an Oswald Mosley type either. But I think, I'm sorry, I lost it a little bit. What exactly was the question again?
Okay, so you answered the first half, that classical republicanism in your mind is philosophically neutral. Now, to what extent are modern republics like the Dutch, the 13 colonies, Oliver Cromwell, and some of the others, not including the French Revolution, that's a whole different category, I think. But to what extent would you consider those classically Republican or in your mind, liberal? Because you obviously agree that classically Republican regimes are not liberal. And the founding fathers, when they created the 13 colonies, were heavily influenced by Greece and Rome and these principles. And unlike the French, they did not believe that, all men, irrespective of their social condition, could vote, and certainly not women.
I'd say when you had the sort of constitutional monarchies that emerged that were kind of personified in England, through people like King George III that emerged like at the time, well, before the time of the Revolution, obviously. But, no, there was that which civil war was this? The one that was going on kind of during like the colonization of the Americas that made England kind of take a back seat to the colonies. Crap, which war was that?
You don't mean the one with Charles and Cromwell, do you?
Was that it? My English history is...
Charles and Cromwell was 1642 to like roughly 1647, and then Cromwell initiated the Directorate, or not the Directorate, the Lord Protector for the next until 1661 or 1660, when Charles II was restored to the throne.
It might have,
or maybe you mean the Jacobite Rebellion in the 1740s.
No, I don't think it was that latter one. I think it somewhere throughout that period that you just mentioned, because my English history is garbage, or I've let it become garbage. But somewhere throughout that period, you had the sort of constitutional monarchy that, George III was sort of personified as, not personified as, but he kind of inherited the power of all the political machinations that led up to him. And eventually, he kind of had to, in the old days, the king probably could have kept waging war in the Americas as long as he wanted to. Like, should the revolutions prior had not taken place, King George III could have tried to reinvade the colonies well before 1812 and things like that. He probably would have had to sign the Paris Peace Accords that ended the war in the first place. But because there were these sort of constraints on him by his, I guess, like the House of Lords and the House of Commons, etc., he had to eventually surrender. And I think that's fairly Republican in style. To get back to the original question, finally, I think that was a fairly Republican in style. Obviously you're replacing the emperor for a king in this scenario, and perhaps the House of Lords and the House of Commons had a bit more power than, say, the senators of Rome, but I do think it is somewhat comparable. And the American system, as it was first written, where senators were decided by state legislators, there was limited suffrage, that kind of thing. I think that's fairly classically Republican as well. Which, and I think I mentioned this during the debate, or perhaps in another discussion I had with you, early America really wasn't liberal per se, as we know it now. Certainly not as we know it now, but even by possibly a Lockean standard, wasn't very liberal. And so I think it is fair to say it did tend towards liberalism, obviously, but it was fairly classically Republican. I wouldn't say it's a stretch to call the founding, like the American Constitution as it was just written, classically Republican.
Okay, yeah. I think maybe that was where some lack of clarity on my part happened. Where, for example, I tend to identify as classically Republican. And I see in the modern age, the Dutch and the Anglos as coming closest to that historic example. But I guess, is there any other comments that we have on the performance? I think we've kind of covered the bases. I'll start with you, Frédéric Bastiat, before we wrap up. Do you have anything more to comment on the performance, pros and cons, advice, etc.?
To be honest, you both perform pretty well overall. Just they're always going to be polishing. So no advice for me. You're like the two best speakers I know, to be honest. Yeah, that's it for me.
Thanks,
culture. What do you have anything you'd like to end with? I think we have kind of covered the whole gamut here. So,
I guess I would say that. Yeah, I think if we have another debate, another discussion, it should be on sort of, to put it broadly, the cosmology of the modern world, so to speak, and talk about what's really ailing it and what's really, we use umbrella terms and shortcuts a lot, like us in politics in general. We like to say all the bad things are usually on this one team and all the good things are usually on our team. And I think that's the case today. Like, we talked about modern woes in the context of the rise of the left, but I don't think the rise of the left is solely to blame for all modern woes. I think there's a broader scope to it, and perhaps if we discuss that, we can get into some more fundamental issues that we were trying to sort of scrap out in that proxy conversation we had before. But I think, I thought it was a good discussion. I think I know how to better clarify myself going forward, and it's interesting to see where perhaps maybe we have a little bit more overlap than initially suspected.
Yeah, I think overall, as a part of the project of the Lyceum debate is to have people of general like-mindedness. Though I could debate a far leftist. It's not beyond their own possibility. Get together to argue, to get better at debate in general. And so I think in this sense, it did serve its purpose. We had a debate. We then reflected on it and thought, okay, maybe it could have been a little more precise here. Maybe we could have done a little better there, and help clarify the overall picture. So I think in that sense, it was a success. And I think this AAR also was a success in sort of teasing out those implications. So I like to thank Frédéric Bastiat for joining and for watching that debate. I'd like to thank Pragmatic Culture for participating in the debate and joining tonight's stream. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.